wisdom today from one of our colleagues whom we love dearly, Holly Antolini. So glad you're on. We're going to wait a couple of minutes as folks join us from all over. Thank you, Steve, for turning on the recording. I'll look at the. All right.
We have people from Maine and Wyoming and Anchorage and everywhere in between.
Awesome. All different time zones.
And Montana. Thank you, Stephen. All right.
People have names on their pictures until their pictures show up or their faces show up, and then they don't have names. So I'm going to be hopeless. I'm hopeless anyway, and I'll be doubly hopeless.
No, well, you'll actually be good if you wiggle your cursor around, the names pop back up again.
Do they? Oh, good.
Yeah, you can see who's talking to you. All right, I have the, oh, Laura, that's a great question, and we'll come to that in just a moment. How do you access the old recordings? And Steve can put a link in the chat for us on the directory for that repository. So welcome to all of you. We're thrilled you're here. Some new faces, as well as people that have helped co-host all of our conversations for years now. Steve, I think we've been doing this for coming up on 5 years in this stretch of conversation. So we're glad to have you on. And if you knew who was on the session here with you today, it's time for a deep bow to the wisdom and the experience that's showing up here. It's absolutely beautiful. We are hosting a series of conversations that relate to people who are in the process that we're considering intentional redevelopment of congregations. And we are especially happy to focus on congregations redeveloping for the sake of engaging people that are not historically engaged by the Episcopal Church. And we spend a lot of time walking around the two loops model of living systems. And we're right there, one foot in the compost pile and the other foot on the bridge over into new possibilities. That's how we describe where we locate this conversation. And we'd love you to join us in that spot on the two loops model, for even if it's just for a minute. Imagine yourself courageously leading a congregation through pivots and shifts and new possibilities. And we've invited a guest to come join us and share her wisdom from real-time experience over almost a decade. And we've invited her to share not only the experience, but what she learned and the personal practices that made that moment possible. So we've invited Reverend Holly Antolini to come join us. And she's going to lead us in an opening prayer. And then I'll invite Steve to introduce her to the rest of us. Holly, would you bring us together around a word of prayer?
Greetings, everyone, and I'm so glad to be refreshed in my awareness of the presence of compost as a rich image. So this is compost prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and mighty God, your entire church is a compost pile these days, if not your world. We suffer the pain of that. The awareness of creepy crawlies and monsters we haven't even come face to face with. But that's a richness. You created the world this way. You created us this way. And so we're going to ground and root ourselves in the midst of that compost in you, in your grace, and trust it. And when we come face to face with rot and critters that are frightening and no way forward, we're going to take a deep breath and root ourselves again in you, because you and your power of creation are always in the midst of us. And for that, we give you thanks and beg you to keep us open and aware. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Holly.
You're
It's a gift. It's like a two-way gift. It's a gift to introduce you to a friend and colleague to both Tom and myself. Tom and Holly have known each other for decades. I have known Holly for maybe a decade less, but since probably the early 2000s. And We worked together at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond. And then when I was in New England, we collaborated some while Holly was at St. James's in Cambridge. And that's the story, part of the story that Holly's going to tell today, the story of the big transition, what happened there, what that pivot was like, how St. James's stayed together. And I see that we have at least one fellow parishioner with us, Holly, Jeff Zinsmeyer's on the call today.
Jeff Zinsmeyer, I dreamt about you last night. Oh my gosh, you and I were engaged in some kind of an adventure, which makes sense.
So without further ado, I'm gonna toss the ball to Holly to tell us a little bit about her experience at St. James's and about that pivot and what it was like.
Well, part of the gift of having Jeff here is that he can add in and refine and redirect some things if I go off track, because after all, I have been retired since 2018. So this was the 10 years preceding that. And Tom Brackett was, by the way, also involved with me from the very beginning in a consultative group very like this, only without the benefit of Zoom. It was over the phone, but it was invaluable. So I'm going to talk to you about the redevelopment we did at St. James's Episcopal Church in Cambridge, and I'm going to do it using a little grid that Stephen, Tom, and I sort of worked up together. So I'm going to trot from one sort of category of thing to another. But let me say first off, if you haven't already heard about this, that what Jeff Zinsmeyer and the other leadership at St. James's and the Grace of God and I collaborated on was taking a Gilded Era church, an historic register church that was in bad condition, and a parish house of 15,000 square feet that was in worse condition, as in I could see daylight around my window frames in the office. Sewage regularly spilled into the rented space below the parish hall bathrooms. That gives you an idea. We took that space, and in collaboration with a for-profit developer, we converted the back part of our lot, removed the entire old parish house, converted the back part of our lot and the neighboring car wash into a 40, how many units, Jeff? 42 unit condominium with our new parish hall on the first floor surrounding our garden. And it was not only a way forward because we no longer had to maintain an unmaintainable parish hall, but it infused the parish itself with energy. They were able to raise the funds to help restore their roof and meet some really basic maintenance demands on their historic building, and begin the process of creating themselves an endowment with the hope that in the long run, they could sustain the historic building even as she decays even further, because she's a grand old lady from 1888. So that's in a nutshell. And the first question that Tom and Steve asked me was, how did you decide to undertake this? And I would say we decided by grace and the Holy Spirit. And by the way, that's the answer to every one of these questions and categories. And I'm grateful that I had had a good 15, 16 years of ministry under my belt as a parish priest before I got to the St. James's job, because I'd learned a thing or two about relying on grace. But it was a huge education in doing that, especially because I had absolutely no experience whatsoever in building something, especially not something in the People's Republic of Cambridge that was condominiumizing church property, which in the Diocese of Massachusetts had never been done before. I say this project decided itself. It arrived 4 days into my parish ministry before I'd preached my first sermon, in the shape of a local developer. She had worked for 30 years in Cambridge. Thank God, she knew Cambridge really, really well. And when she came to talk to us, she wanted us to deed her 10 feet of the garden so that she could build a little condominium on the car wash. She already had a right of first refusal on the car wash property. And she wanted to help us maintain our garden, which we were clearly not maintaining, but her units were going to be looking into. And instead, our 28-year-old senior warden assistant town manager proposed to her that she was thinking too small, that maybe she should think about building down the car wash and across the back of our lot and having a parking entrance on Beach Street instead of Massachusetts Avenue, and building 40 plus units in place of something like 18, I think is what she'd hoped for. But building us a new parish house on the first floor. And I remember her eyes rolling back in her head, but she didn't say no. And the minute she went away, one of our former property chairs and our singular collection of architects and landscape architects who had gathered for this conversation, people I did not know yet. One of them went straight to the Episcopal City Mission, which is a mission of the Diocese of Massachusetts, very old mission of the Diocese of Massachusetts, and obtained a $15,000 feasibility study grant for us. We put out a prospectus. It turned out the absolute ace of consultants, a man who teaches city planning at MIT and does affordable housing development in Boston, and had for 2 decades at that point. And he and an architect came up with a feasibility study over the course of the summer, so that by September, the vestry was voting to take on the process of developing a legal agreement with this developer. And by All Saints Sunday, November of that year, so I've been in place at that point for about 6 months, we had an all parish meeting as part of our Eucharist, and the parish voted 90-6 to do this process of developing a legal agreement with the for-profit developer. Going back to that 4 days into my tenure, the minute I realized the scope of what was possibly on the table here, before any feasibility, before anything, before any grants, before anything, in the moment, I recall explicitly turning to God and saying, God, you and I know that if I say and we say yes to this possibility, even just as a possibility, it's the make or break. If you want me to be a long-term rector of St. James's, we're going to have to make this work. And I don't know how that's going to happen. So over to you. That was very explicit. I had to say it over and over again about 10 million times over the next 10 years. But that's where it all began. I just turned it over. And then we said yes. And Jeff can tell you how much stomach lining it cost, but we kept saying yes, and yes, and yes, through the 2-year process of creating a legal agreement, and then through moving out of our parish hall and eviscerating it for asbestos, and renting office space in one place and church school space in another place and food pantry space in another place, what I called the diaspora. And then 8 years of diaspora and 3 lawsuits, one against our city planning permit, one against our our city historic commission permit, and one against our state historic commission permit, 2 appeals and an appeal of the appeal before we finally got our permit, literally received our permit on my retirement day in 2018. So I arrived in April of 2008. In August of 2018, the city of Cambridge liberated our permit and the building process could begin. And by that time, I had decided that I needed to retire and that it was reasonable to do so, even though it was feeling very Moses-esque, because the next chapter was going to be very different. And I had done what God had called me to do with St. James's. And so I really did turn it over, and the person who's taken my place has been doing a wonderful job of building that next chapter. So leadership. First of all, I want to say that there were those in the parish who had been dreaming about how the car wash could enable a new parish house for years. This was not a completely novel idea. And two of them followed the process all the way through. Sarah Forrester and her husband, Ricardo Dumont. Ricardo is a landscape architect and actually is the architect of record on the parish house. So he actually designed the parish house and the condominium that we built, or that St. James's built, because it wasn't we by that time. So the two of them were very engaged and still are very engaged in the process. And I think that's just really, really key, that there has been long sustained leadership and imagination preceding me. And the other thing that's absolutely critical is that we created the quote unquote redevelopment committee immediatamente, as soon as we were looking for a grant from Episcopal City Mission. So no decision was ever made by me alone, even proposed by me alone. I was always in a conversation, and it was a rich conversation and sometimes a really fraught conversation, but it had immensely integral lay leadership all the way along the line. Very, very collaborative. That's my leadership style anyway, but this certainly enhanced my inclination in that direction. St. James's. Famously, a junior warden had quit a vestry meeting, mid-vestry meeting, in the months before my call, in the middle of a screaming match. And he remained in the parish for a little longer, but quit the parish. The parish had difficult times and intense emotions. And it was a critical part of the work that I did over time, and it takes time to create a culture of listening and all voices welcome. And one of the things I had to do was reclaim chairing the vestry meetings. They had been chaired by the senior warden. And that wouldn't be my inclination. I would just as soon have lay leadership for that, but it felt really important for me to take control of how we did things in the vestry to help make this culture shift. And I would say, and again, Jeff can back me up on this, that by the time I left in the last years that I was there, and this is after all those suits and all that strain, there was a lot of laughter in vestry meetings. There was even, I said in astonishment, laughter in the finance committee. The place had gotten much, much healthier in its way of processing things with itself. And they'd set in motion some transparency, especially about finances, before I got there, thank God. And we just built on that so that people weren't mystified by what was going on, even when the news was difficult about the redevelopment, as it was so often. We maintained our transparency. And the other thing that I feel like I worked to do, besides creating the culture of listening and respecting different points of view, was overcoming a sort of culture of solo wild carding. It is the People's Republic of Cambridge. People are very smart in the St. James's congregation. They are absolutely passionate about many, many things. And they would like to be taking on every problem in the world. And they would like to do it, please, can I start now? And so it took some work to build an expectation that, no, we are not starting now. We are building a group. We are looking at what it would involve. We are making a plan. We are feeding that plan past the vestry. Then we're holding a parish meeting. Then we're going back. So, for example, our Black Lives Matter sign, it took 6 months to get it up from the time that it was first proposed, because it had to be vetted and vetted and vetted before we were ready to say that's who we are. This is a we are this. So that was the other, I think, really important sort of culture shift over time at St. James's. I did have people who were absolutely not going to get on board. I had a finance chair when I came who kept trying to re-chair the meeting in place of me, an elder who did not trust me as a woman to be a leader. And then when I came up with this harebrained scheme of redevelopment, he was not on board with that. And he did see out his chairpersonship, but he then quit the congregation. The fortunate thing about him was that although he was adamant and forthright about not liking any of it, he did not build coalitions around him. So I'm very grateful for that. It would have been really trouble if that early in the game there had been coalition building. Another point at which we had real stress was when we had completed the legal agreement and we had the option to build a little glass garden chapel on our own nickel, not on the developer's nickel as the rest of the parish house was going to be. And by the way, that was a critical decision that the diocese helped us to make, which was that the parish house was the most important thing in our legal agreement. And when we formed our legal agreement with the developer, we made that priority a part of the agreement. So we got less money in payout. We were less equal partners in the deal, but we had the absolute priority of receiving a parish house at the end of it. And we also had the developer responsible for all legal costs. So the parish did not then have to assume responsibility for those things as these suits unfolded and unfolded. We were very fortunate that we had a highly capitalized developer. We were very fortunate that we were in downtown Cambridge and it was an extremely valuable property. But nevertheless, the legal agreement was importantly safeguarding us for that. When the chapel issue really came to a head was when we were preparing to do a capital campaign to fund the furnishings for the new parish house. The last capital campaign the parish had done was in the interim before I was called, and it had not met its goal. It left everybody with a sense of failure and demoralization. So there was a lot of anxiety surrounding this capital campaign, but we had excellent consultants. We had an excellent chair of the capital campaign, a person with enormous credibility in the parish, long-term credibility in the parish. And the consultants did a very thorough interview process and determined that the parish was split 3 ways about the garden chapel. 1/3 was extremely enthusiastic. 1/3 was extremely unenthusiastic, not to say outraged that we would even propose such a thing, because the historic building was in such poor shape and every penny that we had should go into the historic building. And 1/3 was completely confused and didn't really know what a chapel was for. So we had 2 extensive talking circles in the vestry, passing the Bible around. And I mean 2-hour, 2.5-hour talking circles, listening to each other. And in the course of that time, excruciatingly, came to the realization that the parish had made the leap it could make, an astonishing leap, to say yes to this whole condominium parish house idea. And they couldn't leap all the way to a chapel that they would have to fund themselves, that indeed the money needed to go into the historic building. And Jeff Zinsmeyer, who will be in heaven on the strength of this alone, if it weren't for all the other things, oversaw the renovation of the church roof and the rose window on those parish raised funds. And the capital campaign was an immense success and raised more than the amount we aimed at. And that in itself was a huge at a congregation that we could do this. We could manage this. So the only other really intense moment, there were many intense moments, but the only other really intense moment at which I thought the parish might start to break apart in its support for the project was when a longtime choir member who was a landscape architect, world-class landscape architect, who had renovated the garden in the 1980s, pursuing his own vision for it, a beautiful, as he called it, North Shore estate garden that then we couldn't maintain, and it had become a homeless shelter. But he had immense informal authority in the parish, and nobody could challenge him about the garden. We couldn't change anything in the garden because he believed it was, he'd been channeling the great city planner John Nolan when he'd done the redesign, and it was untouchable. And he'd been on the redevelopment committee at the beginning, and then he realized it was just making him too angry, so he'd stopped doing the redevelopment committee. But about 2/3 of the way, maybe even further, maybe 3/4 of the way through the process, through the 8 years after the legal agreement was signed, and before we finished all the suits and the permit release, about 2/3 of the way through that, we discovered, because we learned that he had been resourcing and funding the neighbors who were suing us. So he'd been betraying the congregation. And the vestry was appalled and immensely dismayed. And then the hardest part of it all was that that was confidential information. How we learned of it and what we learned about it was confidential. So we couldn't share all of that transparently with the congregation as we would have hoped. But the vestry did decide that we needed to confront him and that he needed to acknowledge it. He needed to acknowledge what he'd been doing. So the junior warden, the senior warden, and I confronted him, and he would not acknowledge. And he was extremely vituperative. And he attempted, in short order, he attempted to enlist the choir before he actually made the decision that he was taking the option to leave, which was the option we gave him. You can acknowledge or you can leave. Before he did that, he presented his whole dream of what he was doing to the choir. So we had real potential for conflict, really angry people over a wide variety of constituencies within the congregation. And we did a whole after church process on a Sunday with an outside consultant to assist us. And people were allowed to say what was on their minds, and the vestry was allowed to say what was on their minds, but within the constraints of what they could disclose and what they couldn't. And it was very difficult for everybody involved. But in the week succeeding that, I could feel the tension relieve bit by bit. And here's what I perceive about it now from this perspective. What really made healing possible from that was that the vestry itself was truly representative of the breadth of the parish. Young and old, people of color and not, people with families and not, elders, long-timers, newcomers. The vestry really represented the breadth of the congregation. And there was somebody on the vestry you could talk to about from your particular perspective in the congregation. And the vestry was united and very clear about what we'd had to do.
Hey, Holly.
So,
I wonder if we've got some really good questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we get to that. Are we at an okay spot to do that?
Absolutely, yes.
All right. There's a great question here by Nell Archer, who's in the Diocese of Long Island, and she writes, 10 years is an eternity. How did you manage disappointments and maintain hope over such a long period of time?
That is such a great question. First of all, St. James's had been living in perpetual disruption for years before I got there. And this was the first time that they actually had some idea of a plan to resolve the impossibility of their Gilded Era building. So that's just a fact. This was very difficult, but so was everything leading up to it. Secondly, this is a congregation who had, in the midst of its impossible building conundrum, kept its eyes on God's mission. They'd kept doing social justice work in the community. And that's what we did. I like to say, I preached Christ crucified. You know, I didn't try to console people. I gave us a gospel of endurance, of willing suffering, of believing in resurrection, and of serving the people. And I didn't need to preach that serving the people part hard, because it was not to be served, but to serve was the motto of the parish. And they'd been living that. So they really had, they just sustained that approach to things. Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, a partakers prison education program. When Sanctuary emerged in the beginnings of the Trump administration, they immediately got on board with the Sanctuary movement and supported a family in the Lutheran church in town ecumenically. They formed an anti-oppression team and began to have dialogue within the congregation about our own internal systems of oppression, whether racism or other things. And that proved to be very difficult work, but it was work that this parish was ready to engage in. It had a very diverse parish. So that's hugely important in all of this, is that they were, as Steve and Tom taught me, they lived on the border between chaos and order. They were chaotic. Inherently, their culture had always been chaotic, and we were totally chaotic through the whole 10 years. Hugely important leadership in each area of ministry in the congregation. And again, leadership staying in touch with itself, staying in conversation with itself, and sharing the aches and pains was immensely important through this whole thing. So I'll be interested to see whether Jeff has something he could add to that from his perspective. But apart from the points of tension that I've named, I did not fear that we would come apart. I did not, even though our little children had to walk out the rear door, the west door, past the gas station to the Pine Village preschool for church school every Sunday morning, and then back for Eucharist. I did not fear. It felt to me as if the Spirit intended this thing to happen and had endowed this parish with a sense of humor and warmth. Oh, one last thing. We took pews out of the church and we did our life within the church. And after all those years of 15,000 square feet of parish hall, it brought us together to be sharing that space for coffee hour, for church fair, for the Boy Scouts, for anything that had to happen. The Scouts, they weren't boys. They were boys and girls and people who didn't identify as either. So that was hugely important as well.
Holly, there's a question about just the logistics of putting the project together with an outside developer. Did it require approval from the Diocesan Standing Committee or other parts of hierarchy in the diocese?
Great question, and absolutely. In fact, one of my modus operandi in ministry forever and ever was to genuinely work the diocese for all it was worth. So I went right to the standing committee the minute I had any thought about this and said, oh my gosh, here's what we're thinking about, a condominium. How about church property as a condominium? And their eyes rolled back in their head and they made a real estate subcommittee of the standing committee. And they were invaluable, especially Chris Meyer, the chair of that committee, was a godsend to us. So we stayed in very close touch with the diocese all the way through the process. And at key points, they sent people to resource our decision-making, to wit, the decision to prioritize the parish hall over a financial payout at the end. So they were on a learning curve. We were on a learning curve. It helped that I was a dean, because it meant I was in constant conversation with the other deans, in constant conversation with my regional clergy, et cetera, et cetera. So how did I survive? What were my resources? I said to Tom and Steve, I don't read books about how to do stuff. I can't stick with them for whatever reason, but man, I talk with people. I talked with people, anybody who would stay in the conversation with me about what we were doing and why we were doing it, how we were doing it, and what we could do better, and what should we do about this or what should we do about that. I also used the guidelines for communication that we used for our anti-oppression team, and I'm happy to share those with you through Tom and Steve, because they helped us to stay in conversation without getting squared off against each other. Things like, it's okay to disagree. It's not okay to shame, blame, or attack self or others. Be aware of both process and content in the moment. What are your feelings and what do you need to see happen? Just for example, practice both and thinking.
Holly, I wonder if you might talk just a minute about your social hour and what that was like, why that was an important part, your coffee hour, how that created life all along in this process.
It had always been important, and it had always been stewarded by the 1/3 of our congregation who were Caribbean American. It was a huge source of social capital for Caribbean Americans in my congregation. And they had a key leader, Elaine Agard, may she rest in peace, and I'm sure she is risen in glory. Elaine was totally in support of the redevelopment. And when it was clear we're going to lose our parish house in 2010 and not have another one for who knew how long, Elaine said, oh, no problem, we can do it in the back of the church. And she organized it. And she kept at it. And kept at it. And kept at it. And they brought basically a whole meal to church every Sunday, to the back of the church where we'd taken the pews out. And people would just filter out of the pews and arrive at lunch, basically. And so it really wove us together. It really kept us together.
Yeah, I mentioned that because it felt like a thread that could have gone to the wayside, and yet instead it was something that was a symbolic and more than symbolic, but unifying, and maybe another kind of communion.
Yes.
That the church gathered around every week. I mean, when I was there, it had a spirit unlike other coffee hours than I am used to. So.
Yeah, thanks for observing that. St. James's has a charism for raising up people for ordination, and we raised up 5 people for ordination in the time that I was there, and that was just me passing through. They continue to do it, and they had been doing it long since. And that coffee hour gave rise to an inspiration. One of our candidates for ordination, now a priest in Cincinnati, had been in a long relationship with her woman partner, and the bishop said, you need to, if I'm going to ordain you, you need to be married. And they decided to be married in the church and invite the whole congregation and have a dance and coffee hour as their reception in the back of the church. So I don't know, there's just something expressive about that, of the spirit of that coffee hour. It's wonderful.
So I want to, let's see, people are really posting some affirming comments in the chat, Holly, we'll save them. But I'm wondering if anybody has any questions, just invite you to unmute.
Rebecca?
I'm sorry if I missed it, but these condos, are they market rate? Are they a mix? Could you talk a little bit about the condo, the development itself?
Yes,
we
did our feasibility study. We hoped we could make an all affordable complex. We'd hoped that was the basis we could do it on, which is why we had our consultant who was a specialist in that. He turned out to be invaluable and stayed with us through the whole process, but it was perfectly clear by the end of the feasibility study that we could not keep our developer in the game and do it as an all affordable project. So we defaulted to the Cambridge mandate of 15% of the units at affordable rate that the city would oversee the distribution of. And that's what it is. And the rest are market rate.
I do wonder, in the case of vestries, which are unable to overcome some of those tensions, and it becomes almost insurmountable, what kinds of outside resources might be available to help in such cases?
Wow, is that a great question? And in a way, that's a question for the bishop, not for me. Our diocese has a whole stable of volunteer consultants. And, you know, if I had had any thinking time before we were 2 feet in, I think I would have been saying to the diocese, do you suppose we could have a consultant ongoingly who might even come in for vestry meetings on a regular rotating basis to help us with the way we deal with each other? And I can't emphasize those guidelines for communication enough. You know, you don't just learn them. You practice and you practice, and then you do them wrong, and then you return and you practice again. There's no simple answer to your question, Millard.
I will raise, Holly, one point that I think surprised me. So I came into the church about 1.5 years after this had started and became involved in this. And one of the things that surprised me were how angry the neighbors were about what we were doing. And here I was, one of the things that attracted me to St. James is all the missions that we were doing. You know, we were doing out GBIO, getting on buses and going and all this kind of community stuff. I remember talking to a woman who'd come to the church for a community meeting. We had a couple of those. And she had lived in the neighborhood for almost 30 years. And she said, this is the first time I've ever been inside this building, inside the sanctuary. So we've now, in our new church, we have a garden that now opens onto the Massachusetts Avenue, onto the street. We are focusing a lot on direct community neighborhood outreach. We've started doing a thing called Lemonade on the Lawn, and we invite the neighbors in, and we have music, or we have poetry readings, and to try to really become a fabric for the neighborhood. And that would be, because it was almost 12 years that we went through mostly legal battles. And so I think we're trying to change that dynamic.
Hallelujah. I would just add 2 things. One was that there were iron gates across our 3 big arched doorways, and they were locked shut during the week with huge chains, because people were so afraid of the homeless sheltering in the porches. And one of the things I did right away was take those gates down or prop them open and leave them open. No more chains, no, because it absolutely made the building look dead during the week. That was one thing. And the other thing I want to say is that in that onslaught of negativity, 2 things really helped. One was I had served on my local school board in Midcoast, Maine, before I went to Virginia and then came to Cambridge. And I knew local politics, and I knew how ugly people can be to the very people they've been friendly with in the grocery store yesterday when you're on the other side of the table from them. So I was prepared. I wasn't blindsided by the level of vituperation. And consequently, I was able to really help with a kind of long-term training of ourselves not to take on the negativity. We just didn't take on the negativity. We went to work on making our project as the best we could make it. You hear from Jeff's testimony that the congregation has this spirit of generosity and reaching out. They always have. And so they just went with the positive and not with the negative. And it was like surfing over huge waves, but we got there.
I'm wondering if we might just do a little reflection. You know, the topic of today was, how do you handle a pivot, one that you have planned for or one that surprises you, and how do you stay together? And as you've heard Holly talk about this, what are some things that you hear of that might be practices for a congregation in troubled times, or a congregation in a difficult pivot, or a congregation kind of leaning in a courageous way to a new way of being? What are some of the things that you're hearing? You can put them in the chat or just speak up, but what are some of the things that you're hearing that might be valuable practices. Froze.